All rise. The bailiff's voice, worn smooth by years of repetition, scraped across the stale air of courtroom 3B. Judge Albright entered, a man whose black robes seemed to amplify his aura of bored impatience. He settled into his high-backed leather chair with the weary sigh of a monarch forced to adjudicate the squabbles of peasants. Before him stood the day's first case, docket number CV 78-942, the city versus Jane Doe. The Jane Doe was a woman named Alara Vance, though the court had yet to afford her the dignity of a name. She stood beside her young, visibly nervous public defender, a slight figure swallowed by a frayed men's army jacket several sizes too large. Her gray hair was a tangled nest, her face a roadmap of hard years, and her hands, clasped loosely before her, were calloused and still bore the grime of the street. Prosecutor Davies, a man whose ambition was tailored into his sharp suit, approached the lectern with a predatory smirk. "Your Honor, the state presents the case against this individual," he began, gesturing toward Alara as if she were an unpleasant piece of evidence. "Charged with vagrancy, unlawful camping, and loitering within 50 feet of a federal monument. The defendant was found sleeping on a bench at the War Memorial Plaza. She was non-compliant, refusing to provide identification or answer basic questions. His tone was a masterclass in condescension, each word polished to a fine sheen of contempt. Alara remained silent, her posture not slumped but still, a weathered rock against which the waves of legal jargon crashed and receded. Her eyes, a pale and startling blue, were not fixed on the prosecutor or the judge, but on the American flag that hung, perfectly folded in its display case, on the wall behind the bench. Sarah Jenkins, the public defender, felt a tremor of panic. This was her third case out of law school, and her client had not spoken a single word to her. Not one. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Albright's voice cut through her anxiety. "Is your client capable of understanding these proceedings? Or will we need a competency hearing to go along with this farce?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Let's get on with it. How does the defendant plead?" Sarah leaned in, whispering urgently to Alara, but the old woman gave no sign she had heard. The silence in the courtroom stretched, becoming a tangible presence. It was no longer a mere absence of sound, but an act of defiance. Prosecutor Davies sighed theatrically, tapping his pen on his legal pad. "Your Honor, this is precisely the behavior reported by the arresting officers. A belligerent, uncooperative attitude. A clear lack of respect for authority and for the institutions that provide for her welfare." He used the word "her" with a clinical detachment, as if diagnosing a particularly stubborn disease. The judge's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. His schedule was tight, packed with cases more significant than a piece of human debris cluttering up a public park. He saw a problem to be processed, a file to be closed. He did not see a person. "I will ask you one more time, madam." The judge's voice was low, but it carried a distinct threat. "How do you plead to these charges? Guilty? Not guilty. Your silence will be taken as contempt, and I assure you, the accommodations at the county jail are a significant step down from a park bench." A few chuckles rippled through the small gallery, courtroom regulars and board clerks enjoying the minor morning drama. Alara's gaze finally shifted. It moved from the flag, past the judge, and settled somewhere in the middle distance, as if looking at a horizon only she could see. Her expression was unreadable, a placid mask of endurance that seemed to infuriate the judge even more. Sarah Jenkins cleared her throat, her voice barely a squeak. "Your Honor, my client may be suffering from trauma. We request a continuance to allow for a psychological evaluation," Davies scoffed. "A convenient delay. The only thing she's suffering from is a lifetime of poor choices. The city's taxpayers shouldn't have to foot the bill for an evaluation every time a vagrant decides to play silent." Judge Albright nodded in agreement, his patience completely exhausted. "I'm inclined to agree, Mr. Davies. This court's time is not a therapeutic tool." He leveled his gaze at Alara, his eyes cold and hard. "Last chance. Speak, or you will be held in contempt." The room held its breath, anticipating a breakdown, a shouted curse, perhaps tears. They received nothing but the same profound, unyielding quiet. As the judge prepared to deliver his verdict of contempt, Sarah Jenkins felt a rising tide of desperation. She had failed. Her client was about to be railroaded, and she was powerless. In that moment of frantic helplessness, her gaze fell upon the woman beside her, not as a case file, but as a person. And she saw something. On the filthy, frayed collar of Alara's jacket, almost hidden in a fold of fabric, was a small, tarnished pin. It was a dark blue rectangle, framed in gold, with a single star at its center. It was not a trinket. It had the distinct, severe geometry of a military award. Her eyes darted down to Alara's hands, which were now resting on the edge of the defendant's table. As the woman shifted her weight, the cuff of her jacket slid back a fraction of an inch, revealing the edge of a tattoo on her weathered forearm. It was not the crude, blurry ink of a prison tattoo. The lines were faded but incredibly fine, depicting what looked like the talons of a bird of prey clutching a broken spear, interwoven with a series of letters that were partially obscured. A cold knot formed in Sarah's stomach. This was not the random paraphernalia of a troubled mind. This was a language. The stillness, the unwavering gaze, the disciplined economy of movement. It wasn't belligerence. It was control. It was the bearing of a soldier. A soldier who had seen and done things that had stripped away every non-essential word, leaving only a core of hardened silence. The judge's impending pronouncement faded into a dull drone in Sarah's ears. She was a public defender. Her job was to see the person everyone else had discarded. And for the first time, she was truly seeing the woman who stood beside her, not as a homeless vagrant, but as an enigma wrapped in layers of pain and history. That pin, that tattoo, they were keys, and she suddenly felt an overwhelming, terrifying responsibility to find the lock they opened before the judge threw them, and the woman who wore them, into a cage. "I have had enough of this insolence." Judge Albright's voice boomed, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He pointed a trembling finger at Alara. "This court is a pillar of our society. It demands and deserves respect. Something you, madam, clearly know nothing about." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a theatrical, menacing whisper. "So I will ask you one last time before I have the bailiff escort you to a holding cell. Do you have anything at all to say in your defense?" The room was electric with anticipation. The prosecutor smirked, victorious. The bailiff shifted his weight, ready to move. Sarah held her breath. And then, Alara Vance spoke. Her voice was not loud. It was low and raspy from disuse, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room with an astonishing clarity. Every word was deliberate, measured, and heavy with a conviction that made the judge's angry outburst seem childish in comparison. "Respect," she said, her pale blue eyes finally locking with the judge's, "is not a uniform you put on. Your Honor," she paused, letting the words hang in the air. "It is a standard you uphold." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Sarah Jenkins felt a jolt, as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The words were a simple, profound truth, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had lived by a code far more demanding than any civil statute. But to Judge Albright, it was the ultimate challenge. It was a peasant lecturing a king, his face contorted with a fury that was absolute. "That's it," he roared, his voice cracking. "Contempt of court. 180 days. Bailiff, take this woman into custody. Now." He slammed his gavel down onto its wooden block with a sound like a gunshot. The sharp, percussive crack echoed through the courtroom, a definitive, angry punctuation mark on his decree of power. But the sound did not make Alara Vance flinch. Instead, it seemed to make her grow even stiller. The crack of the gavel was not wood on wood. It was the bolt of a Dragunov sniper rifle slamming home, a metallic echo across a silent, triple-canopy jungle. The sterile, air-conditioned chill of the courtroom dissolved into a humid, oppressive heat that smelled of red earth, rotting vegetation, and fear. The murmuring voices of the gallery became the frantic, whispered chatter over a PRC 77 radio. Alara Vance was no longer in courtroom 3B. She was kneeling in the mud of a Laotian listening post, a place that didn't exist on any map, surrounded by a team of men whose names were now just ghosts in her memory. The black robes of the judge became the dark, starless night sky. The fluorescent lights were the terrifyingly bright magnesium flares that meant a position was about to be overrun. Her hands, resting on the polished wood of the defendant's table, remembered the cold, familiar weight of a AR-15, the grit of dirt under her fingernails, the slick warmth of a comrade's blood. For a fleeting, terrifying second, the bailiff approaching her was not a paunchy man in a cheap uniform, but a shadow detaching itself from the jungle treeline, a glint of steel in the moonlight. She instinctively braced herself, her body coiling with a lethal muscle memory that had lain dormant for 50 years. Her breathing slowed, her heart rate dropped. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the threat. This was the control they had mistaken for defiance. It was the ironclad discipline forged in places where a single uncontrolled breath could mean the death of an entire team. She closed her eyes for a mere second, forcing the courtroom back into focus. She was not Nightingale anymore. She was just an old woman in a cold room, and the only enemy was the crushing weight of a world that had forgotten her. The bailiff's hand was almost on her shoulder. The fight was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. She had survived the jungle, but she was not sure she could survive this. "Stop!" The word tore from Sarah Jenkins' throat, raw and desperate. Judge Albright glared at her, his face a mask of thunderous rage. "Ms. Jenkins, you are dangerously close to joining your client in contempt." But Sarah was no longer looking at him. Her eyes were glued to the screen of her court-issued tablet, her face pale with shock. Acting on pure instinct, she had typed in the fragments she'd seen. Faded star pin military, broken spear talon tattoo, special forces insignia Vietnam. The search results had been a frustrating mix of hobbyist sites and conspiracy theories, until she added one more term. Classified. The search algorithm churned, and then a single result appeared, flagged with warnings of high-level clearance and federal penalties for unauthorized access. It was a heavily redacted Department of Defense archive link, but 3 words were visible in the summary. Project Nightingale. MECVSOG. Ghost Unit, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. The most clandestine, high-risk special operations unit of the entire war. The name sent a chill down her spine. These were legends, ghosts who operated deep in enemy territory where the U.S. was not supposed to be. As the bailiff's fingers brushed the fabric of Alara's jacket, Sarah shoved her chair back and stood, holding up her tablet like a shield. "Your Honor, wait. You have to see this. You are making a terrible mistake," she yelled, her voice shaking but resolute. The prosecutor was on his feet, objecting. The judge was banging his gavel, shouting for order, but Sarah stood her ground. And at that exact moment, as the chaos in the courtroom reached its crescendo, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room were pushed open, not with a bang, but with a quiet, irresistible force that seemed to suck all the sound out of the room. 2 United States Air Force Security Forces personnel, immaculate in their dress blue uniforms and white gloves, stepped inside. They took up positions on either side of the doorway, their movements crisp and synchronized. They stood at parade rest, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed forward. They were an honor guard, and they were clearing the way for the man who followed them inside. He was in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and a posture so straight it seemed to defy gravity. He wore the uniform of a 4-star general of the United States Air Force, and the galaxy of ribbons and medals on his chest told a story of a lifetime of service and sacrifice. On his shoulders gleamed the 4 silver stars that signified his rank, a rank that commanded armies, advised presidents, and held the power of life and death over thousands. The air in the courtroom changed. The humidity of indignation and petty tyranny was replaced by the dry, cold atmosphere of absolute authority. The snickering gallery members fell silent, their amusement curdling into awe and fear. Prosecutor Davies, who had been shouting objections a moment before, now stood frozen, his mouth agape. Judge Albright, in the midst of bringing his gavel down again, stopped mid-swing, his arms suspended in the air as if flash-frozen. The general's steel-gray eyes swept the room once, taking in the scene with a glance that missed nothing and judged everything. His gaze passed over the cowering prosecutor and the stunned judge without a flicker of recognition. His entire focus, the full and undivided attention of one of the most powerful military officers in the world, settled on the frail, disheveled old woman standing at the defendant's table. He strode down the central aisle, his polished black shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum floor. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, a drumbeat marking the end of one reality and the beginning of another. He did not slow until he stood directly in front of Alara Vance. He looked at her, and in his stern eyes, a flicker of something ancient and profound appeared. Not pity, but a deep, shared understanding. Then, in the dead silence of courtroom 3B, General Marcus Madsen drew himself up to his full height, brought his right hand up in a flawless, razor-sharp motion, and rendered the most profound salute any person in that room had ever witnessed. Colonel Vance, the general's voice was not a shout, but a low, resonant baritone that carried the unmistakable weight of command. It filled every corner of the courtroom, each syllable a polished stone of respect. General Madsen, I apologize for the delay. We were not aware of your situation. He held the salute, his hand a rigid line at his brow, his eyes locked on hers. The title, Colonel, hung in the air, a sonic boom that shattered the reality of the courtroom. Colonel, not Jane Doe, not vagrant. Colonel. Judge Albright's face had gone from red to a pasty, bloodless white. His arm, still holding the gavel, fell to his side with a dull thud. Prosecutor Davies looked as if he had been physically struck, his carefully constructed case, his entire worldview, crumbling into dust around him. Sarah Jenkins lowered her tablet, tears welling in her eyes as she watched the scene unfold, a moment of honor so pure and powerful it felt sacred. For a long moment, Alara Vance did not move. She simply looked at the general, a universe of shared history passing between them in that silent gaze. Then, slowly, with the weary grace of an old warrior, she drew her own frail hand up. Her fingers trembled slightly, but the motion was sure, the form perfect, as she returned the salute. It was a ghost of a gesture, but it held within it the iron of a lifetime of discipline. As the general lowered his hand, the spell was broken, and the courtroom seemed to remember how to breathe. A low murmur swept through the gallery, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The bailiff, who had been about to place Alara in handcuffs, had retreated several steps and was now attempting to make himself invisible against the wall. The court reporter's fingers were frozen above her keys. The entire machinery of justice had ground to a halt, brought to its knees by a simple gesture of respect that had completely inverted the power structure of the room. The homeless woman was now a colonel, and the judge was now the one on trial. General Madsen turned his attention to the bench, and the warmth that had been in his eyes when he looked at Alara was replaced by an arctic cold. His gaze was a physical force, and Judge Albright visibly shrank under its weight. Your Honor, the general began, and the title was an undisguised insult. Let me illuminate the situation for you. As you seem to be operating in profound ignorance, he took a step closer, his voice never rising, but gaining an intensity that was terrifying. You have before you Chief Master Sergeant Alara Vance, United States Air Force, retired. That, however, is a cover designation for her official, unblemished record. Her actual rank, classified under Title 50 until this moment, is Colonel. She was a field-commissioned officer serving with the Studies and Observations Group, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. He paused, letting the infamous acronym, MCVSOG, settle into the room's consciousness. She operated under the call sign Nightingale. The pin on her jacket, which you likely mistook for a piece of trash, is the Presidential Unit Citation, awarded to her unit for extraordinary heroism in covert operations in Laos, 1971. The tattoo on her arm is the insignia of the Ghost Unit, a team of forward air controllers and long-range reconnaissance specialists so secret, its operational records were sealed for 50 years and its members were listed as administrative clerks at a base in Ohio. The general's voice dropped lower, becoming a recital of a history written in blood and courage. This woman, this vagrant, personally directed over 400 combat air sorties behind enemy lines. She was declared missing in action on 2 separate occasions and was once officially listed as killed in action. Her intelligence and her courage on the ground were directly responsible for saving the lives of over 200 American servicemen. He took one final step toward the bench, his eyes boring into the judges. Among those lives saved was a young Air Force captain, a fighter pilot shot down over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the spring of 1972. A man who owed his life, his career, and his entire future to the voice on the radio that guided the rescue choppers through enemy fire. A young pilot by the name of Thomas Albright. The general let the name hang in the suffocating silence. Your father. The courtroom ceased to exist. There was only the cavernous silence and the judge's ragged, shallow breaths. Thomas Albright. His father, the decorated hero, the man whose portrait hung in his chambers, the ghost of perfection he had spent his entire life failing to live up to. The stories his father had told, sanitized for a child's ears, had always included a mysterious, nameless voice on the radio, an angel he called his nightingale. He had thought it was a poetic flourish. Now, the truth stood before him, clad in rags, and it was devastating. Judge Albright stared at Alara Vance, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the quiet strength his father had always lauded, the unshakable calm he had always described. And he saw the woman he had just mocked, humiliated, and sentenced to jail. A wave of nausea and self-loathing washed over him so intensely he had to grip the sides of his bench to keep from collapsing. The general's voice cut through his shame like a surgeon's scalpel. All charges are to be dismissed. Immediately. With prejudice, it was not a request. It was an order. Of course, General. Yes, immediately. The judge stammered, fumbling with his papers, his hands shaking so badly he could barely function. Case dismissed. Prosecutor Davies, looking utterly broken, gathered his files and practically fled the courtroom without a backward glance. As General Madsen gently placed a hand on Colonel Vance's elbow to guide her away, she stopped. She turned and, to everyone's astonishment, walked slowly back toward the bench where Judge Albright sat, a broken man stripped of his robes of authority. The general took a protective step forward, but she raised a hand, stopping him. She looked up at the judge, her pale blue eyes holding no triumph, no anger, only a profound and weary sadness. The uniform doesn't make the man, Your Honor, she said, her quiet voice a balm and a judgment all at once. The man makes the uniform. Your father understood that. She then turned her gaze to where Davies had been standing, as if speaking to his shameful retreat. And you, son, never mistake silence for weakness. The loudest voices are often the most empty. With that, she turned and walked with the general toward the courtroom doors, leaving behind a chamber filled with the wreckage of arrogance and the humbling, redemptive light of grace. Sarah Jenkins watched them go, a young lawyer who had just received the lesson of a lifetime. That justice is not about statutes and precedents, but about seeing the honor hidden in the most unlikely of souls.